Name of Allah, the most merciful and the most gracious. Dear students, our today's topic will be the learning behavior. So, first of all, we would consider the definition of the learning behavior, and it is a change in behavior which results from different types of experiences. Another definition for learning behavior is that learning is a process which manifests itself by adaptive changes in individual behavior as a result of experience. So, because of this learning behavior, the animal or any organism learns to adapt to its environmental conditions, which are the adaptations as a result of some past experiences. We are going to talk about the importance and characteristics of the learning behavior. Learning behavior can involve some choice of the responses, means if the stimulus is of any kind, it is the choice of the individual or of the organism who is getting a stimulus to respond in any way. Also, learning is not directly controlled by genes. This is not the speciality of the learning behavior, but in innate behavior, it is controlled directly by the genes that we discussed in the previous video. Learning behavior can also help the animal to become better suited to a particular environment or set of conditions. So, again, it is the choice of the organism to adapt to the certain environment or not to adapt to that particular environment. So, learning is more prominent in those organisms that have comparatively longer lifespan as compared to the innate behavior in which the organisms had a short lifespan. Plus, in the learning behavior, the animals have a well developed nervous coordination. Learning behavior should be developed with experience. Of course, if we learn something that is from our surroundings and that is as a result of the stimulus that is received by our environment, and it can easily be modified, it can be changed according to the surroundings, and it has a direct involvement of the brain that we discussed in the previous slide. So there are two more points which we discussed already. Moving to the next slide, learning behavior has the following types. Thorpe classified learning behavior into 6 types, which are imprinting, habituation, conditioning or conditioned reflex type 1, operant conditioning or conditioned reflex type 2, latent learning, and insight learning. So, in today's topic, we will discuss the first 3 types of the learning behavior. Here is the first type of the learning behavior, that is imprinting. One way in which animals learn to behave is imprinting. Let me give you an example. A goose swimming across a lake or moving on a grass. One by one, the goslings would follow after her. Whenever she goes and wherever she goes. because they have undergone through a process called imprinting. And imprinting, certain newly hatched birds and newborn mammals learn to recognize and follow the moving objects they see, which is usually their mother, but it can be some non living object as well. So, imprinting occurs shortly after a young animal hatches or is born, but it mainly occurs after 36 hours of its birth. Imprinting involves a combination of an instinctive behavior and learning. The young animal has an instinct to follow the moving objects, but the youngster is not born knowing what its mother looks like. The young animal must learn from experience what object to follow. Imprinting is very valuable to many animals because first they keep the young animals close to their mothers. Secondly, it allows the young animals to understand what other animals or species look like. Imprinting was first studied by Conrad Lorenz in 1935, who was an Australian scientist. So, here, imprinting, a form of learning in which an animal forms an association with another animal or object in the environment during sensitive period of development. So when the young bird or any other mammal hatches, right after their birth, any organism they see, they would start following that animal as has been shown in the picture. Second type of the learning behavior is habituation. It is one of the simplest forms of learning. Let's talk about habituation as an example of learning. This is the process of responding less strongly over a period of time after a repeated stimulus. Or it is the simplest form of learning, and an animal learns to ignore a repeated irrelevant stimulus. The importance of habituation is that a loss of receptivity, paying no attention to repeated stimuli, can be useful in preventing a drain, means the wastage of energy, preventing attention of unimportant purposes, plus habituation is highly adaptive. Notice is a change in behavior after a repeated stimuli. It becomes less responsive over time and it becomes less annoyed and interrupted. Example is a snail moving across a sheet of glass retracts into its shell when trapped. After a short pause, it emerges and continues moving. A second trap causes retraction again, but it emerges more quickly. In this way, finally, the snail will show no response to the trap. Another example is of street cows and buffaloes, which, when once become threatened by some horns of the vehicles, but after the repeated exposure to the horns of the vehicles, they would become less responsive and they will pay no attention to the horns. In this diagram, you can see an animal which became scared of the noise of the machine at once, but then these things have started to grow on the animal, means they have no effect on the animal. It became less at first, and then finally they will be not bothered by the noise of any kind of machine. So this is called habituation. Now we will compare habituation and imprinting as a reversible and irreversible learned behavior. So habituation is the loss of response to a stimulus after repeated exposure. This process is reversible, and if the stimulus is repeated a second, third, fourth, and fifth time, and so forth, the animal becomes less responsive. That we have discussed already. On the other hand, imprinting is learning that is limited to a specific time period in an animal's life, and that is irreversible. It remains throughout the lifetime. Then the third type of learning behavior is classical conditioning and conditioned reflex type 1. We are going to talk about conditioned and unconditioned type of responses and stimuli here. So conditioned and unconditioned response is basically how we behave when we come across to basic stimuli. Ivan Pavlov was a scientist who was born in Russia. He found that sometimes the stomach secretion and salivation begins when no food had actually been eaten by many of us. So let us talk about the unconditioned response first. Unconditioned response is a behavior that occurs naturally to the given stimulus. If there is food, for example, in front of you and you smell the dish, the feeling of hunger in your stomach in response to the smell is unconditioned response. The conditioned response, on the other hand, is little different. So it is the learned response to the previous neutral stimulus. So if you take the previous example with the smell of food at the same time a bell rings, this experiment would be repeated at the times you feel hungry every time you hear the sound of the bell. This is the conditioned response. For example, Pavlov take the example of dogs. In the first picture, you can see on the sight of the food, the dog started salivation, which is unconditioned stimulus, and as a result, unconditioned response was produced. In the second diagram, you can see the neutral stimulus was given to the dog, that was the ringing of the bell, but no salivation occurred that was called the conditioned response. It was not conditioned response actually. In the third diagram, you can see the food was given to the dog with the ringing of the bell, and the dog started salivating again. So, this was the unconditioned response. But in the fourth diagram, what is shown here? Wholly and solely on the ringing of the bell, the dog started salivation. So, this was the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. So, the dog made an association of salivation when the bell started ringing. This is all about the conditioned and unconditioned stimuli, and as a result, the conditioned and unconditioned responses. I hope it's clear to you. If you have any kind of question, you can ask. Thank you so much.